Well, hello, everyone. My name is DeAndrea Singleton, and I'm the Diversity Inclusion Chair for the Cornell Undergraduate Research Board.
And my name is Tara Joseph, and I'm also on the CURB Executive Board.
And it's a pleasure to welcome you all to the second part of CURB's Identity series. So we're excited to have you all join us in learning more about research from our two speakers this evening. Both of their research topics are extremely interesting and niche, and we cannot wait for our speakers to share what they have to share today. So before we get started, here are some quick logistics for these presentations.
All right, so each speaker is going to be sharing a short presentation, and that will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session. If any questions come up during a speaker's talk, please hold them until that Q&A session at the end, where you will be allowed to just drop them in the chat.
Okay, and with those reminders, I think we're ready to get started, and I will be passing it off to Olivia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia, and I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Connie Yuan, whose research focuses in the area of organizational communication and intercultural communication. And I will now hand it off to Dr. Yuan to present her research.
Hi, everyone. My name is Connie Yuan. I have a joint appointment in Department of Communication and also global development. So my research, include organizational communication, as Olivia mentioned, also intercultural communication. I'm also faculty in residence in Clara Dixon Hall. So actually my talk today is a combination of my teaching, my research, and also a bit of a self-reflection, because of personal experience. Identity is like it's a core to all of us, right? It's a core issue. Okay, identity. So what does it mean? So basically, my talk today, roughly 4 sections. So first, what is identity? Characteristics of identity and interesting theories related to identity, the impact of globalization, additional resources. And yeah, I think, it seems like, this is not the first talk about identity. You guys probably know that already. So I only cover a bit of the theories that relates to, there's so many theories about identity. I only cover those as, kind of core to my research. So what is identity? Who am I? So basically how you answer that question. So this is what I come up with to describe myself. So I have a Asian, a woman, middle-aged, extroverted, introvert. So these are the different words I can use to describe myself. So I kind of put them in the clusters. Really I checked with the leader of the organization. It seems like it's talk, not interaction. But I don't know whether people want to throw in a quick answer here. Why do you see any pattern? Why the clustered grouped this way? Do we have any quick response? Quick guess here? No? Okay. Okay, so I put them into these clusters because these traits usually they are so here on the left side the visible ones, Asian, woman, middle-aged, and these ones are invisible traits, cisgender, Buddhist scholar of organizational communication, intercultural communication. And also I have a few in between, a professor, a mother, a Chinese American. So the reason I put them in between here, this left side, they are visible, and these are invisible. And these ones can be in the middle, because the professor may dress in certain way, just by looking at how a person behave or dress, sometimes we can guess, whether a person, their identity. And I also have some in the different highlights. This is another dimension to talk about identity. So these ones that don't have a highlight, these are more inherited traits that define who we are. And the other ones are acquired identities. I was not a Buddhist when I first came to the US, and I am a very dedicated Buddhist right now. And organizational communication scholar, that's a trait that I was not born with, but that's something I acquired through professional training. And professor, mother, all these, not inherited traits, but acquired. And I put a Chinese American in a different highlight. I will explain that to later. That's again, is acquired trait. I was born, grew up in China. I was a Chinese, but become a naturalized citizen around 10 years ago. So now I'm a Chinese American. So that's again, acquired attribute of who I am. Okay, so here, so very key ideas about identities. Identity is multidimensional, meaning I'm, all these traits can define who I am, and identity is changing, which means, okay, these are the traits, the green highlighted ones, these are traits that change. I was not a Buddhist, I am a Buddhist now. When I was in college, I was not an intercultural scholar, but I am now. So identity is changing. Why this matters? And also the visible, invisible traits and inherited, acquired. So all these are different ways to describe our identity. Why do they matter? So here are the theories that I think is very interesting to talk about how identity will influence our daily interaction. So this is very well-known idiom, birds of a feather flock together. Basically means like similar people find each other. Why is it like, why does it matter? So here's actually a data I collected from my class. I teach an organizational communication class pretty much every fall. And so in that class, I asked a student, I replicate an experiment from a journal article. So the journal article is about a social mixer. So the researcher want to find out, as a social mixer, do people really mix? So at the beginning of the class, I actually told the student, you guys go and mix and see, who you talk to. So I did this, after they finish a social mixer session, I asked them to report who they have talked to during the session. So this is the data I collected from my class. You can see the red ones, they're female. The blue ones are male. And just observing the pattern, you can see there's a lot of females that just talk the whole time. They just talk to females. And there's some males that talk to males. So actually same gender pairs, 74% of people just talk to the same gender. And the mixed gender pairs, only 26%. And but then the other interesting, so 46% of female only talk to female, but male talk to others. There's no 0% of male talk to male only. What does that mean? What's the implication? So this is actually relates to okay, an issue with diversity and inclusion. So this is another the same data I plotted by so this one, departmental affiliation, because it's a communication class. So same means like people from the same major. The white one means like people from different major that interact during the social mixer session. And here's the gender, same gender, 72%, 23% like a cross-gender communication. But what's interesting is the baseline. The baseline is roughly the same. The class, 71% communication major, roughly 70% female. So this is the majority is a female, majority communication major. And then 29 and other major, 23% male. So roughly the same baseline, but you can see it's very different here. People, you have more interaction between people from different majors, but much less across different gender. What does that mean? So it really shows like the visible traits, that's usually the ones that divide us. You see what I'm talking about here? Because gender is more visible than departmental affiliation. So that's why in the social mixer, people naturally gravitated toward others with same, race, same gender. So this is very common in homophily research. People tend to be divided by the visible traits. So this can cause, actually, challenge for, if we really talk about inclusion, how can we rise above our comfort zone and talk to people who are different from us? So if you work, I also teach in the area of organizational communication. So in organization, if you really want to encourage diversity and inclusion, it means like we should help people rise above the visible divides among us, and really focus on the invisible ones. So for example, common interest. We're all interested in studying communication, all interested in studying STEM. So this should be one, the invisible ones should be the focus of the focus of attention when we really want to encourage DEI initiative in organization. Okay, and so relates to that one is the other very interesting theory, social categorization theory. We are all our choices, which means like because our identity is multidimensional, which dimension that's salient for us at this moment that influence our interaction with others, that's within our choice. So this is actually, in a sense also relates to the belongingness, a sense of belonging when you join a new organization. So when you take myself as example, I'm still, if you talk about like sense of belonging by race, by ethnicity, I'm still the only Asian in my department. But this is a visible trait that may be the dimension that separate me from my colleagues. But when I join an organization in my department, I focus on what I share in common with my colleague. For example, we all study communication. That will be the dimension that make me feel belong. So this is, I think, is very useful for people, like for minority people, how you survive in the organization when you're a minority member. So because we have a choice to decide which category is most salient in certain social interaction. So when we are in minority, focus on what we share with common with others, and then focus on the invisible traits that maybe can do a better job uniting us with others. That will be actually more useful. So this is the value of the social categorization. So we have agency, we can choose how we interact, which dimension of our identity is salient in a certain situation, and make us more comfortable interacting people who are different from us along the visible characteristics. Okay, the other thing that's core to my research and the teaching is the globalization, the intercultural dimension. So I want to share a story with you. This is the Forbidden City of China. So I was born and grew up in Beijing. So I've been to this place, dozens of times. An interesting story I want to share is I think back in 2018. I took a few communication professor to Beijing. We taught summer class at one of the universities. So one day we went to this place, and right after we got there, no more than 5 minutes, one of my colleague asked why there are no trees. And I was shocked because I have been to this place, as I told you, dozens of times. It never occurred to me why there are no trees. Why am I sharing this story with you? This shows the value of globalization. So, when we grew up, no matter which culture we grew up in, we are tunnel vision about our education. It's only when we encounter with people from different culture, then they help us see that what we usually take for granted. So this is a value of globalization. When you're exposed to people who are different from you, they open up your perspective. But here's a few things I want to remind people when we talk about impact of globalization, cross-cultural similarity, the differences. I think when we talk about intercultural communication, a lot of times we focus on differences. Indeed, there are a lot of differences across culture between China, between US. There are just a lot. But on the other hand, we shouldn't take things for granted. And there's a lot of similarities too. Actually, one of my recent research is really comparison, of decision-making styles between the Chinese people and American people. So past research said, okay, Western American represent the West, and the China, people from mainland China, that's actually is Eastern culture, and people from Hong Kong of China is biculture. But what's really interesting in our data collection about decision-making style, actually Chinese students from China behave in the same ways with Americans. So that was really interesting find. It just like we're still collecting data for that project. So I think the lesson I want to share here, there are differences across cultures, but there's also actually a lot of similarities. So it's very important we understand the cultural differences, but on the other hand, we also have to be open-minded to about commonalities across the nation. The other one is the third culture individual, the global nomads. So this relates to the idea that I talked about earlier, people's identity that change. So it happens, when you move to a different culture, you start acquiring a new dimension of identity. So in intercultural research, the special term that's called a third culture individual. These are people like, for the term actually happened, first came out, describe some people like Americans born in Africa, born in other culture. And then they start, developing a unique identity that's not American, not African country, but it's really above beyond both cultures. And for me, because, actually, I was born and grew up in China, but spent, the past 25 years in the US. So am I Chinese? I'm American. Or, you start having a different identity that's above beyond both cultures. So this is in the past, I think immigrants, the research on immigrants, they start talking about like the challenges immigrants face, but actually this is in the era of globalization. When globalization become more common, you see more people, they start developing unique identity that's different from the either the country they immigrated to or their home country. They start developing their third culture. They call it third culture individual. There are also people travel around a lot, around the world. They're called global nomads. And in the past, there's a lot of research talk about, okay, these people, they have no roots and they don't have a strong sense of belonging. But there's also a new group of research talk about this is actually, these people enjoy being the global nomads because they become more, as they exposed to more cultures, they become more multicultural, more open to differences. The other thing earlier, so I mentioned the word Chinese American. So this is an interesting challenge that I actually have gone through in the past 2 years. When the relationship between China and the U.S. become more intense. So in the past, this relates to extension of the third culture individual. As people move around, a lot of times the culture, when they they're not in conflict, it's not a problem. But because of the strained relationship between China and the US in the past few years, and actually still ongoing, I have gone through quite a struggle. Your affiliation, your sense of belonging. And to me, the reconciliation is a humanity. I'm a human first before I'm either Chinese or American. So that's actually can be a way for people to resolve the conflict, the internal conflict they may have, as the different dimensions of their identity are in conflict. And the other thing I want to mention, in intercultural communication research, the key idea is a difference without hierarchy. And this actually applies also to the relationship between ethnic and racial groups in the US. So in intercultural setting, you need to respect people from different culture. People are different and there's no hierarchy. Same applies to relationships between different race and ethnicity. So this is just a quick overview of what I teach in the research, and I think the important lessons about identity. Additional resources. This is an article, Intercultural Personhood, really talk about, in era of globalization, when people move from country to country and they start developing a different, identity relates to the third culture identity. And the key idea is personhood and the focus on humanity. And here, the integration of Eastern Western perspective, because usually people think the two are very different. But Kim, she said like the two, even though there's a lot of differences, they can be brought together to create a personhood, intercultural personhood. This is my article I really loved, and also my student loved this article too. And when I teach intercultural communication class, I asked a student to write reflection papers. A lot of people wrote, a lot of students wrote their reflection papers on this one. And the other two, I think, are interesting YouTube talks. One is the danger of a single story. It's very eye-opening talk. Talk about the dominance of Eurocentric approach not just in society, but also in knowledge, how we create a knowledge. And the talk about the danger of one single story, again, encourage people to explore different stories, different way of creating knowledge and creating their own story. And the third culture kids, that's again talk about in the year of globalization, how people develop their identity that's rise above, beyond the culture they grew up with, and also the culture they immigrate to, they start developing a third culture. Okay, I think that's all my my talk. It's a lot of stuff. I hope this is a kind of conversation starter, and I hope be useful for you to start thinking about some of the issues related to identity.
Okay, thank you for that amazing presentation. We'll now be opening our Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature.
Questions?
Yep. Jennifer?
Hi, yeah, this is such a great talk. I think, especially like as a Chinese American myself, I think it's also like really interesting to see, like for my parents at least, they grew up in China and then they came here after college, and seeing how they view a lot of like different, especially important topics from their perspective. But then as someone who like is Chinese and grew up in a very Chinese household, but also grew up completely in America, I also view like certain topics either similarly or like the same. And then also I have friends that I've like met through college or high school who are maybe like second or third generation. And I feel like just like the impact of like when you talked about globalization, but then also just like kind of seeing how like growing up in not only in like a Chinese household in like America is very like a unique experience. And I think it gets more and more unique like the more we kind of like not only integrate ourselves but also kind of try to preserve our own identity as we're in like a completely different country. And like that blend and also like the preservation of culture, I think is super important. And I feel like I really liked your talk a lot. And I was also wondering, do you think you could also send out the links to the videos or the reading after, or maybe in the chat? Because I would like that. I would love to see those.
Yeah, sure. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Interesting comments. Yeah, growing up in the second generation, there's cultural difference from your parents. That's another very interesting topic to explore. And also the other thing, I want to mention, relates to the similarity and differences. So in the past, there's a lot of discussion about how Asians or, Asian Americans, how they should behave. A lot of times people think they're by culture, but it really, our identity, as I mentioned, is situational, it's contextual. Sometimes like the Asian side will come out, sometimes like the American side will come out. Actually, in my class, I try to replicate some of the studies findings. Most times, Asian Americans behave in the identical way as Americans. So this, again, I want to remind people, don't judge people by the cover. So it's really, just you can, as it's very important we be aware of cultural differences. But on the other hand, every interaction, social interaction, we should treat the other person as an individual person, because you just don't know. There's a lot of similarities, and then there's differences, but also a lot of similarities. Okay. Other comments or questions? Tara, okay.
Yeah, that was a really interesting talk. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your time. I was wondering, how did you choose to focus on organizational communication and intercultural communication when you were like in your career path and choosing a focus for your research?
Okay. I think how organizational communication. I just love studying management. I think it's so interesting. Yeah, so okay, hold on a second. I'm trying to, probably I shouldn't do this. I was trying to copy paste the link for the student. I think, yeah, a professor in college had, during my graduate school, huge impact on me. And I think studying organization is very interesting in the sense because how do you get people to work on something together? So that's a starting point about intercultural communication, because right now, if you join the workforce has become so diverse. You have to work with people who are different from you. And how do you really benefit from the diverse expertise from people who are different from you? So I think in the era of globalization, that's just basic skill you should have. And also maybe partially because of my background. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings between cultures, uh, which is unnecessary. But intercultural communication, intercultural collaboration has huge potential. If people can really take that, like a cultural difference as a resource, you can benefit a lot. Just like the example I showed you earlier, taking my colleague to a forbidden city. It's just like right there, she was able to see what I've never been able to see, even though I've been to the place like a dozen of times. That's basically when I grew up in Beijing, I went there so often, but it never occurred to me. But the reverse can happen too. Like, working with people who are different from you is a resource. It can be challenging because people are different. But on the other hand, it's also promised the biggest gain that you cannot gain otherwise. Because when people, very similar to you, you see things the same way. But only when you work with people who are different from you, automatically they can see things that you never paid attention to. We are tunnel visioned by our education. No matter how open American education is, it's always like it's just unavoidable tunnel vision by being tunnel visioned by our upbringing, education. Are there
Any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, we can conclude our Q&A round for Dr. Yuan. Thank you for your questions, and thank you so much for your presentation again. I'll now hand it off to Alison to present our next speaker.
Hi everyone, my name is Alhasan, and I'm pleased to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Riché Richardson. Dr. Richardson's research focuses on how the United States South has shaped the construction, gender, race, and sexuality in the United States. I will now hand it over to Dr. Richardson to present her research.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to join you all this afternoon. I really appreciate Professor Yuan's talk and insights. And I so agree that we learn from our differences. I am a scholar originally from Montgomery, Alabama. I was born and raised there. And I am currently on the faculty at Cornell in the Africana Studies and Research Center, where I mainly teach courses in the field of African American literature. And I also teach in areas such as gender studies and Southern studies, along with cultural studies and critical theory. My research project has focused on several key concerns over the years and from its inception in the PhD program at Duke University, where I did my graduate work. I focused on the status of the US South in shaping categories such as the African American and the American, as well as discourses of race, gender, and sexuality. And so those questions have served as a common denominator across many of my research projects over the years, whatever they have been. And my research project has largely um, been concentrated in my first two books, beginning with Black Masculinity and the U.S. South from Uncle Tom to Gangsta, which was published at the University of Georgia Press in 2007, and more recently, Emancipation's Daughters, Reimagining Black Femininity and the National Body, which was released from Duke University Press at the beginning of last year. The research area and theoretical paradigm that I think has mainly energized my work is the New Southern Studies. And at this point, I want to share the screen. This is a theoretical mode that was introduced by the scholars Houston A. Baker Jr. and Dana D. Nelson in 2001 in a special issue of the journal American Literature, which Professor Baker edited at the time. And it reflected an investment in thinking about the ingenuity that scholars were increasingly bringing to the field of Southern studies by looking at areas such as gender studies, studies of race, sexuality, and taking more nuanced approaches to region as well, and also increasingly divesting from the conventional approaches to Southern studies premised narrowly on um, nostalgia and romance, or the idea of a Southern birthplace, temporalities such as the Civil War, the civil rights, or locational politics that mainly uh, relegated the South to the area below the Mason-Dixon line, the South in the United States, and the North as being above it without considering some of the uh, critical nuances that we might explore. For instance, linked to Malcolm X's famous comment that the South in the United States is anywhere below the Canadian border, which is an orientation that offers unique and expansive, exponentially expansive critical possibilities for thinking about what it means when we think about the South. And to pluralize it is something that scholars in the field have also increasingly done, drawing on perspectives in American studies, for instance, postcolonial studies, to decenter the US in our understandings of the concept of the South, and to acknowledge that there are multiple Souths, to think about the the Souths, for instance, in South America or South Central America, what it means when we look at the the U.S. As a kind of North, and think about the continuities across this Western Hemisphere. So discourses of the global South as well as the hemispheric South have also importantly informed methodologies in the New Southern Studies. In this volume, keywords for the New Southern Studies is one that I highly recommend for anyone who's really interested in digging deeper in the field. So I edit a series at the University of Press at the University of Georgia Press called the New Southern Studies, which originated in 2005 and has published numerous titles in the field that I really think of as a kind of toolbox that's indispensable for doing some of the best and most critically incisive work. In this volume, keywords for Southern Studies came out a few years ago, co-edited by Scott Romine and Jennifer Greason. It overviews some of the vocabulary that's valuable for examining the field. The issue of American literature was one context in which the epistemology of the New Southern Studies was advanced. Houston A. Baker also importantly draws on the New Southern Studies and the development of his volume Turning South Again, which was published that year. And I think it, to a certain extent, animates even another volume published that year entitled Critical Memory. And so these are some of the critical foundations that I want to acknowledge that have valuably informed and impacted my own research and the trajectory of it over the years. Um, and within the New Southern Studies on that critical terrain, I have developed a few approaches that have been unique in certain ways. This idea of drawing again on Professor Baker as well as V.S. Naipaul, coming up with just this notion of Southern turns that I found to be a phenomenon in the early 2000s, where a lot of popular culture work and even work in fiction, um, to a certain extent, literature was increasingly focusing on the South and the United States. And in my first book, I examined the Dirty South rap movement. And so to see that confluence of interest concentrated in relation to the US South was also very interesting. And so my essay, Southern Turns, was just a contribution published originally in the Mississippi Quarterly that aimed to reflect on those dynamics by thinking about Aunt Jemima as a longstanding stereotype, the linkages with the phenomenon in the media of a, 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 a woman originally from the Caribbean, but enacting a persona called Miss Cleo. And so the similarities between Miss Cleo's marketing um, as a figure in the media versus Aunt Jemima's in the late 19th century were astonishingly parallel. And I found that to be fascinating. And I looked at tourism, the problem of sex tourism in the Caribbean, and how, ironically enough, it was reinforced even in a film such as How Stella Got Her Groove Back. So those are some of the concerns that come up in that essay. The notion of the Africana South is one that I have increasingly analyzed and introduced in my more recent book, Emancipation's Daughters, Africana Souths, to register the the geographies grounded in an African history and shared legacy that inform and shape Southern identities as drawn from the Caribbean, the United States, and other geographies linked to the African diaspora. And so Africana South is a concept to, I think with and through when we look at the notion of the South in the broadest sense as far as people of African descent are concerned. In more recent times, I've thought about what it means to how urgent it is to turn south, especially in light of a lot that's going on in our political culture, a lot of the reactionary political views that are increasingly circulating. Um, that we can think of Trumpism and the agendas that have unfolded under that heading since his election in 2016 as the president in this nation, and the 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 increasingly toxic public sphere in politics that this ideology of Trumpism has fomented, that had its foundations and origins in Trump's birtherism ideology that he weaponized against President Obama, as well as the Tea Party and its agendas that were steeped in a very problematic kind of populism that was premised on purist notions of American identity as being essentially white. So, this culmination of those very reactionary politics that were emergent in the first decade of the 21st century um, went to the extreme under the heading of Trump. And that's definitely been a problem. The pandemic, I think, has only thrown a lot of these ideological issues into even um, bolder relief, where we witnessed the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th last year. And it's important to raise questions about what it means that um, we saw symbolism circulated at that point. You know, we're a gallows, and then the Confederate flag was hoisted at that point, and very problematic rhetoric as well. And a lot of this rhetoric is very much steeped in the notion of a lost cause, traceable back to the post Civil War era, and very reactionary ideologies rooted in the US South that are also inextricably linked to white supremacy. And so, one of the things that I think is important is to register the lingering traces of this reactionary ideology that Donald Trump fomented all the more once he became president, which in a way built upon some of the very problematic ideology that Woodrow Wilson had dispersed into the political public sphere even in the early 20th century. He famously sanctioned the film Birth of a Nation, for instance, in 1915, showed a screening in the White House, and famously commented that it's like writing history and lightning. And so it becomes very disturbing that there are vestiges of these poisonous ideologies still circulating in our public sphere. And what's so important when we think about the discourses of Birth of a Nation and having them invoked in the US mainstream is that the location, the setting for the action in Birth of a Nation, which is based on novels of Thomas Dixon published in 1902 and 1905, The Leopard Spots and The Klansman, respectively. South Carolina is the setting, and the novel and film rehearse this view of blackness as being lower in intelligence. Black people, it suggests, we're lower in intelligence, we're imbeciles, we're unfit for politics, and we're inept leaders. And so those films, the film and the novels, were premised on a panic about the possibilities for Negro rule in the South. And they were very much invested in discouraging Black voting rights, and also glamorized and promoted the Klan as a solution to any kinds of lingering national problems, including the cleavages between the South and the North in the wake of the Civil War. So to have even vestiges of that extremely problematic ideology invoked in late 2020 in the wake of the election of Joe Biden, so this notion that the election had been stolen was propagated in that moment. And there's been this panic about an increasing number of people of color, including many Black people, having the right to vote. And so there, and then, intensified efforts to disenfranchise these populations. And so that's another reason that I think that it's important for us to draw on epistemologies related to Southern studies, including the new Southern studies, in our dialogues, if we are to understand the gravity of these ideologies and how they're being reintroduced into our public sphere in very problematic ways at this point. Um, Another thing that I think makes this important is the context of the pandemic. What does it mean that Donald Trump largely took a laissez faire approach in dealing with the pandemic, that he pandered to primarily a cohort of Southern governors that very decidedly um, refused to enforce, the recommendations as far as masking and 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 we're very resistant to a lot of the policies that were coming down from the national level designed to promote public health. And so when you have this states' rights ideology resurface in our nation's public sphere through the back door, it becomes very problematic. And so in my own scholarly work at this point, I've increasingly talked about the importance of not just the new Southern studies, but a now Southern studies. Because I feel that it's urgent for us to think about the the very problematic citations of these reactionary Southern epistemologies in our nation's public sphere and how much they threaten our democracy at this point. Another topic that I've explored extensively in more recent times is this this concept of Beyonce Souths, primarily in relation to my teaching. I teach a course at Cornell entitled Beyonce Nation, which I first introduced in 2017, and I have the privilege and pleasure of teaching it again this semester. Beyonce's father, Dr. Matthew Knowles, has also been a participant in this course and contributor by helping to make it a master class, drawing on a lot of his archives and resources related to Destiny's Child and Beyonce. And so it's been a really wonderful experience. Black national femininity is a concept that I introduced in my more recent book, Emancipation's Daughters. And it looks at Black women as a different kind of subject. Typically, we're most familiar with the notions of Black women as being abject, other, and devalued in the national culture. But sometimes we don't think as much about the obverse. What happens, what is possible when Black women surface as the premier global and national subject? I want to, at this juncture, just turn to some brief discussion of my book project, Emancipation's Daughters, to continue to put more of this in perspective. So, this project was very much a labor of love. I started it in 2007 originally, and the project itself is dedicated to my grandparents, Joe Richardson and Emma Lou Jenkins Richardson. These photos of them were taken during the 1940s in Pensacola, Florida, one Sunday afternoon on Palafox Street. And they were living there at the time. They're actually listed in the Florida Census of 1945. And they were part of a veritable Montgomery diaspora that went to Florida for various jobs that had opened up during the war era. And so my grandfather was building barracks as a contractor in construction. My grandmother worked ship service, doing things like this was in the Navy Yard, doing things like filling out ledgers and passing out uniforms. We still have her ID badge during that time, and it was one of her most cherished possessions. And she once described that time as having been her happiest ever. And so after they left Pensacola, they went on to Daytona Beach, where the men, largely in our extended family, helped to build beachfront houses there. And so it was typical for the wives to go along with their husbands at that time. And so my grandmother also had very fond memories of living in Daytona Beach. She got sightings of the national leader, Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the president of Bethune Cookman College. And so my grandmother's stories about living in Daytona Beach were what helped me to think about the legacy of Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune, and especially considering her work in the National Council of Negro Women, which she founded, and on the nation's capital, thinking about her leadership in the NYA, the National Youth Administration, in which my grandmother had also been trained as a young woman. And it opened up so many doors. And so it's significant that I come from this history, and it very much shaped my interest in focusing on Mrs. Bethune in my first chapter. These are the newest members of our family, the babies of our family. Um, Kyrie, the older one, is 4 years old now, and his brother Malachi is 11 months. So this is a photo of them from a few months ago, and then one more recent from Easter Sunday, Sunday before last, where they're at home celebrating, and so it all um, always goes back to them. But this is an image of the cover of Emancipation's Daughters. And I'm also an artist, and so my art, in some cases, is a context where I also address research questions very similar. I mean, questions very similar to the ones that I engage in my academic research. And so for this project, I ended up illustrating all of my chapters, the main chapters, with art quilts that I have made over time. And so my art quilt of Rosa Parks was chosen by graphics at Duke University Press as as part of the design for the cover. I'm really thankful. The piece itself is in the permanent collection of the Rosa Parks Museum at home in Montgomery, where I'm from. So the four chapters again focus on Mary McLeod Bethune, Rosa Parks, Condoleezza Rice, and Michelle Obama, with the conclusion focusing on Beyonce. And so the first chapter looks at the leadership legacy of Mary McLeod Bethune, and I, I I consider the Bethune National Monument and the decades long project it was to bring it to fruition. And so this is the first major monument that was erected to a person of African descent in this nation, on the nation's capital, and in juxtaposition with Freedom's Memorial. And so it has a lot of symbolic significance. And so I do an analysis of this monument and the project of bringing it to fruition, which was very much a labor of love on the part of the National Council of Negro Women for many years, primarily spearheaded by the leader Dorothy Height. And then I go on to look at the congressional hearings that unfolded in the early 80s and on related to the question of making Council House, which was the national headquarters for the National Council of Negro Women, a national historic site. And Mary McLeod Bethune had been a symbolic mother and had made very well known national contributions. And so it was very ironic and a bit odd that there was a lot of questioning of whether or not it was an appropriate thing to do to make Council House a National Historic Site and to invest public funding in it. And so I look at those transcripts and analyze them, including the reactionary political attitudes in part of that chapter. My chapter on Rosa Parks, um, the mother of the civil rights movement as she's known, uh, looks at her arrest photo. This isn't an arrest photo from December 1st, 1955. That's often what it's mistaken to have been. But this is from February of 1956. And it's one of numerous arrest photos of Blacks in Montgomery for supporting the bus boycott in Montgomery that was just kind of taking off at that time. And I think that foregrounding this photo for analysis does a lot of things. At the beginning of my chapter on Rosa Parks, it establishes, for instance, that the Montgomery bus boycott wasn't not an individual effort as much as a community-wide effort. And so that's one thing. But then the optics, I think, are also very significant. You know, this is a very iconic image of Rosa Parks. And so my opening analysis in that chapter goes back to the scene on the night of December 1st, 1955, looking at James Blake as the bus driver and how much the scene was premised on Rosa Parks's on 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 humiliating her not only on the basis of race but then also on the basis of gender, sexuality. in the sense that James Blake was well known for um, lodging epithets at Black women and humiliating them in public. And so it's important to think about an epistemology of sexuality in relation to Rosa Parks as well. And this is all the more, I think, important when we think of her scripting as the mother of the civil rights movement. And so what that image means. I go on to look at the Children's Museum that was opened in her name. And the Children's Museum is part of the larger Rosa Parks Museum at the site of her arrest. It's where my quilt is on public display. So it's one of those works that you see within the art montage in the lobby. And the Children's Museum is a much more interactive kind of installation. And so I use discourses of Afrofuturism to explore that site and to historicize it and to think about its deeper implications. The Condoleezza Rice chapter looks at how reaction has also, in some cases, mediated Black women's national iconicity. Um, Condoleezza Rice became the most famous Black woman in the world and most powerful one in certain ways when she served as initially national security advisor for the administration of George W. Bush, but definitely this was the case once she became Secretary of State. And so I look at the popular representations of Rice, which stage fantasies of Rice as being very dedicated to the Black community and in solidarity with it, which was a narrative that ran counter to actually what ended up happening in Rice's political practice in many cases. And so that's another chapter that helps to advance the argument. And one thing I do in this book is to take the long view. I think that's very important. Like I talked about Trump and his administration in terms of setting the reactionary tone that we see at this point in our political public sphere of politics, but I think it's also important to go all the way back, you know. And so even with George W. Bush, I am committed in this study to putting in perspective how that administration's policies also has helped to bring us to where we are right now. And the chapter on Michelle Obama looks at Michelle Obama's initiatives as First Lady, the first Black First Lady in this nation, related to obesity, you know, dealing with childhood obesity, and examines the projects that she spearheaded, including collaboration with Beyonce, which I think is very important. But I begin that chapter by looking at her speech at the Democratic National Convention in 2008 and how she construed herself as this kind of representative woman. And so the through line and argument of this book focuses on Black women's writings, all of these women's writings and contributions on some levels, but then looks at how all of the policies that they've advanced at the national level have centered families and children. So often, these Black women who have emerged as icons nationally and by extension globally have also consistently, I think, represented families and children, but they've emerged as they've emerged as global icons, and they've countered the reactionary narratives of Black women as being abject. And so that's another thing I think that really sets them apart in important ways. And Beyonce shows that if this has been a phenomenon in politics, it's also to a certain extent impacted and shaped popular culture. So um, these are just some of the main concerns that have been raised within my book. And the maternal motifs that run through that mediate these women's presence in the national public sphere, I think, is so important. The downside of all of this, though, is that these narratives have typically been premised on heterosexual identification, and they have routinely excluded Black, queer, and trans women who have not really been legible within these national narratives. And so one thing that I argue is that it's really important for our sense of who can represent the nation, to the extent that it remains a formation that continues to be legible, who can represent it? What does that mean? And in order to achieve you know, the the most inclusive democracy, it's going to be important to expand who can be included, who can be legible within it. And I just want to show a few more images. So this is the stamp unveiling. I was invited by the Rosa Parks Museum in 2013 to be the speaker for Rosa Parks' 100th birthday. And so the postmaster um, invited me to be part of the stamp unveiling of the commemorative stamp honoring Rosa Parks. And so this was very special. I'm standing by the founding director of the Rosa Parks Museum, who is also my art mentor and curator, Georgette Norman. I participated a few years ago in this landmark project out of Cornell University Press entitled The Scholar as Human, where a range of scholars, primarily based at Cornell, discuss our commitments and our commitments to and experiences of public scholarship. And so it's definitely that kind of project that can give everyone more of a sense of these possibilities. And so in my case, I talk about the work on Rosa Parks, my exhibitions at the Rosa Parks Museum and what they've meant and how they've built in certain ways upon my academic work. This is a view of the Rosa Parks Library and Museum that I mentioned, the Children's Museum, and the installation, the bus installation at the heart of the Children's Museum, which gets a lot of analysis in my chapter on Rosa Parks. These are the 4 girls who were tragically killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church in August of 1963. September of 1963, I mean, in the wake of the famous speech of Dr. King on the on Washington at the March on Washington. And so actually these young girls initially became national icons and I think really helped show some of the possibilities for Black women emerging as iconic in ways that were not premised on objection as we often saw in the Aunt Jemima stereotype, which I've critiqued in the media. Um, these images are by Enrique Chagoya, whose work was so important for helping to develop the argument in my chapter on Condoleezza Rice. And so his images that really critique her alignments with the reactionary Bush establishment in the 2000s are indispensable for Emancipation's Daughters. And this is an image of my um, one of my art quotes of Condoleezza Rice, and then this is the other one. And so all of those appear in the book. A view of the first Black Vice President Kamala Harris, as well as Stacey Abrams, who's currently a gubernatorial candidate in the state of Georgia. I think that this book could not have come out at a better of time. Not only was it a labor of love, but I think it is really a valuable toolbox for helping us to understand how it became possible for someone like Kamala Harris to become the first Black woman vice president in this nation, or how Stacey Abrams' iconic impact on politics has become conceivable, especially looking at the preface in Emancipation's Daughters. You really understand the conditions of possibility for these phenomena. So I don't think that the book could have been published at a better time, for clarifying how this actually has happened. And I would go so far as to add more recently Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And when I say a now Southern Studies, I'm very much speaking of the now that Stacey Abrams talks about in this important book, underscoring the value in looking at intersectionality when we examine our citizenry, so we will understand in a very acute and keen way the specific needs of the population and think about, why it is crucial right now to protect and promote voting rights as a right for every citizen. So I'll end there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richardson. That was an amazing presentation. I'd now like to open up a Q&A session. If anybody has a question for Dr. Richardson, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, Tara.
Hi, Dr. Richardson. Thank you so much for your talk. That was really amazing to hear all of that and such incredible research. I was wondering, what are the future directions for your project? What are the next steps that you're thinking about focusing on?
Next steps. That's really a wonderful question. I was working on this book, and my last shot at it was November 2020, right around it after the election, when it had gone through the copy editing phase, and so I was able to acknowledge the election of Kamala Harris. And it is always tough to think about, well, where next? Then the insurrection happened, and my goodness. And so over the past year, I found it's very valuable to actually turn to Beyonce studies as one of the ways to bridge from Emancipation's daughters to a lot of what we're seeing now, in the sense that the discourses of Birth of a Nation, again, are so tacit in everything that happened on the Capitol, because the anxiety, one of the underlying anxieties has had to do with the empowerment of a portion of the demography that some don't consider to be genuine American citizens or legitimate American citizens, because the idealized American citizen is white in their minds. And so the premise is that the election was rigged because the wrong people were allowed to vote, who should never have had a right to vote. And so when you have a discourse like that, the 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 basis is definitely, it becomes a dog whistle of sorts, and the basis is this view, the tacit view of the quintessential American subject as being white, and it goes back to some of the colonialist ideologies that frame the quintessential subjects as being white, male, property, uh, Christian, and so forth and so on. But there's there's a sense of unbelonging that's then projected onto everyone else. In his poem "I Too," Langston Hughes famously says, "I too sing America. I too am American," and that's a sentiment that also was echoed, I think, across a range of multi-ethnic autobiographies in the early 20th century of people. We can think of Anzia Yerzierska's Bread Givers, for instance, as one of those works, even Gertrude Stein's works, but just a range of figures coming into this nation and claiming it as their own. And so Langston Hughes was no exception to that narrative. So why I think Beyonce is fascinating for all of this is that in Formation, she gives us a very different model of American identity that's more inclusive, more diverse, more representative of the dynamism of a range of ethnic, racial groups, as well as, like if we think about the song Formation, but then also her powerful staging of the performance at the Super Bowl in 2016, where she's celebrating the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party, and then also the legacy of Malcolm X, and then really in certain ways paving a way for Kaepernick's Take a Knee, and questioning forms of violence that have occurred against Blacks. And of course, the video itself for Formation takes on anti-Black police violence, and she's very much been aligned with Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Take a Knee, and Mothers of the Movement. So what I argue in my work is that Beyonce gives us a formation nation, and it's a more inclusive idea of America that is the direct opposite of that purist, racist notion of the nation premised on white supremacy that D.W. Griffith gave us in Birth of a Nation. So my talks last year centered the discourse on Beyonce to talk about, the birth of a formation nation and now Southern studies and why we need that as a first step out. But then I'm working on a new project now that looks at Black Southern women writers of the 21st century. If my family and civil rights histories and legacies are very much at the foundation of Emancipation's daughters, my new book in development is also very much inspired by family on some levels, but then also um, committed to thinking about some of my sister friends, authors such as the phenomenal Honore Jeffers or the phenomenal Tiari Jones. And so this new project looks at the the global South in represented in and across the literatures of a new generation of Black women writers who have come front and center in the 21st century. And so the chapters focus on authors such as, beginning in the preface, actually looking at Honore Jeffers, but then goes to Edwige Danticat, because it's important again to think about not just the US centered South, but the South in the broadest and most hemispheric sense. And so Edwige Danticat is there, Dolan Perkins Valdez, who just published another important and landmark novel entitled Take My Hand, which is incidentally set in my hometown, Montgomery, Alabama. Then there's Natasha Trethaway. It is Jessamine Ward, and as well as some visual art. I'm really excited about this book. I always have to come to the point of articulation for my projects, and I'm 2 years in now working on this one, and so I'm just looking forward to all of the possibilities. The series continues to go in exciting directions as well.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions for Dr. Richardson? Okay, so with that last question, I would now like to conclude the Q&A round for Dr. Richardson. Thank you so much for your questions, and of course, thank you, Dr. Richardson, for your amazing presentation and your responses. With that, I will now hand it over to DeAndrea and Tara to close out the event.
Thank you, Hassan. That was amazing. And once again, a big thank you to our amazing speakers. Thank you, Dr. Yuan, and thank you, Dr. Richardson, for your talks. They were really good. If you guys can give them another round of virtual applause, that was amazing. Lots of good stuff taken from that. And I'll pass it off to Tara.
Yeah, so we really hope that everyone was able to learn something interesting and new about research related to identity and its importance moving forward. I hope that everyone has a really good evening, and thank you so much for joining us in the midst of preparing for finals season.